The velvet-drenched air of the penthouse lounge was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, rhythmic thrum of bass. But all Austin could focus on was the silence between the couple in the corner. He stood at the mahogany bar, swirling a glass of amber liquid that cost more than most people made in a week, his gaze anchored on Dizzy and Portia. To any other guest, they looked like the industry's golden pair. But Austin, who had spent a lifetime studying the spaces between people, saw the truth. He saw the way Dizzy's eyes were constantly darting to his phone, checking stream counts and studio schedules while his wife stood beside him like a beautiful, forgotten statue. Portia was radiant in a crimson dress that clung to her curves, her magnetic beauty drawing eyes from every corner of the room, yet the only man whose attention she craved was miles away in his own head. Austin watched as she reached out to touch Dizzy's arm, a silent plea for connection, only for him to lean away to answer a vibrating notification. It was a small movement, a microscopic rejection, but to Austin, it was a thunderclap. The cracks in their marriage weren't just visible. They were wide enough for a predator to slip through without a second thought. "He's doing it again, isn't he?" Austin murmured, appearing at her shoulder with the practiced grace of someone who had spent months perfecting his orbit around her. He didn't wait for an invitation to join them. He simply stepped into the vacuum Dizzy had created. Dizzy looked up, offering a distracted grin and a brief fist bump. "Austin, man, glad you're here. Keep Portia company for a second. I've got to take this call from the label. It's about the album rollout." Without waiting for an answer, Dizzy disappeared into the crowd, the music producer's ambition once again overriding his role as a husband. Austin turned to Portia, noting the familiar, bitter edge in her expression and the moisture she was trying to blink away. The moonlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the tears she refused to let fall. "Dizzy always did put the music before the muse," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made the surrounding party fade into a blur. He didn't stand as a friend. He stood as an observer who had finally seen his opening. He watched the way her breath hitched when he didn't pull away, realizing that her loneliness had made her vulnerable to the very flattery he was prepared to give. In the high-stakes game of their social circle, Austin felt the first thrill of a reckless impulse turning into a consuming obsession, knowing that tonight, the best friend mask was finally beginning to slip. The studio was a tomb of high-end equipment and dampened sound, the air thick with the lingering scent of Dizzy's stale coffee and the hum of powered-down amplifiers. Dizzy was 300 miles away in Atlanta, chasing a lead on a new percussionist, leaving the sanctuary of his creative life unguarded. Austin let himself in with the spare key he'd held for years, the weight of the metal in his palm feeling less like a symbol of trust and more like a master key to a forbidden kingdom. He wasn't there to check the levels on the latest track. He was there because he knew Portia would be in the apartment upstairs, drowning in the silence Dizzy had left behind. He found her in the lounge, illuminated only by the blue glow of the recording console and the city lights bleeding through the blinds. She didn't look like a woman expecting a business meeting. She looked like a woman waiting for an excuse to break. "Dizzy asked me to double-check the masters for the bridge," Austin lied, his voice a low vibration that seemed to fill the hollow space between them. He didn't stay by the door. He crossed the room with a predatory grace, moving into the orbit she had spent the last hour trying to escape. Portia didn't ask to see the files. She didn't even turn toward the computer. She just looked at Austin, her eyes searching his for the validation that her husband had traded for a platinum record. "He always sends you, doesn't he?" she whispered, her voice laced with a bitter edge that Austin knew exactly how to sharpen. "It's easier for him to trust you with my time than to give me any of his." "Maybe that's because he thinks I'm as blind as he is," Austin replied, stopping inches from her. He could smell the jasmine on her skin and the faint, sweet scent of the wine she had been sipping alone. Without a second thought for the consequences, he reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her neck where a gold chain rested. The air in the studio grew heavy, charged with a decade of suppressed history and a sudden, electric tension. When she didn't pull away, the best friend mask finally shattered. In the shadows of the room Dizzy built for his dreams, Austin claimed the reality his friend had neglected. As he leaned in to bridge the final gap, the years of brotherhood were traded for a single, breathless second of betrayal, starting a fire that Austin never intended to put out. The rush of the secret was a drug more potent than any substance Austin had ever sampled in the dark corners of the music industry. Within weeks, the quiet shadows of Dizzy's studio felt too small, too restrictive for the fire he was stoking. Austin began to crave the friction of the world's gaze, finding a twisted satisfaction in seeing how close he could dance to the flame without getting burned. He stopped making excuses about checking in on Portia and started taking her out, to high-end bistros where the candlelight played off her skin, and to underground jazz clubs where the music was loud enough to drown out the lingering echoes of his conscience. He sat across from her at a secluded booth in a dimly lit rooftop bar, the city skyline stretching out behind her like a sprawling neon empire. Portia looked breathtaking, her magnetic beauty amplified by the thrill of their shared defiance. To anyone passing by, they were just two beautiful people enjoying the night. But to Austin, every lingering look and every accidental touch beneath the table was a victory over the man who thought he owned her heart. He watched her laugh, a genuine, vibrant sound he hadn't heard when she was standing in Dizzy's shadow, and he felt a surge of reckless pride. He wasn't just her lover, he was her liberator, or so he told himself to keep the image of Dizzy's trusting face at bay. "We shouldn't be here, Austin," Portia whispered, though she didn't move to leave. She ran a manicured finger along the rim of her glass, her eyes darting toward the entrance every time the elevator chimed. "If one of Dizzy's assistants or a photographer walks in..." "Dizzy is buried in a mixing session across town, Portia. He doesn't see anything that isn't on a waveform," Austin countered, his voice dripping with an easy, dangerous confidence. He reached across the table, boldly covering her hand with his in plain view of the other patrons. The risk was an aphrodisiac, a jagged electricity that made his blood hum. He liked the way her breath caught, the way she looked at him with a mixture of terror and adoration. He was operating entirely on impulse, moving from one moment to the next without a second thought for the morning after. In his mind, his charm was armor, and his status as the loyal friend was the perfect camouflage. As he leaned forward to whisper a joke in her ear, his lips brushing against her hair, he didn't see the wreckage they were creating. He only felt the heat of the fire, convinced that as long as they kept moving, the shadows of betrayal would never catch up to them. The boundary between a reckless game and a consuming obsession finally dissolved on a Tuesday night in the studio lobby. Austin stood by the vending machine, his knuckles white as he gripped a bottle of water, watching Dizzy return from a successful session. Portia was there, performing the role of the supportive wife, and for a fleeting second, she forgot the secret language she shared with Austin. She reached out, smoothing the collar of Dizzy's jacket and offering him a tired, genuine smile of pride. To Dizzy, it was a moment of marital comfort. To Austin, it felt like a serrated blade across his ego. The sight of her hands on another man, even the man who actually owned the house, triggered a possessive roar in his chest that he could barely stifle. Later that night, when they were alone in the dimly lit hallway of the penthouse, the tension snapped. "What was that back there?" Austin demanded, his voice a low, dangerous hiss that lacked any of his usual producer's polish. He cornered her against the wall, his shadow swallowing hers. "The doting wife act. You looked a little too comfortable playing house with him tonight." Portia looked at him with wide, startled eyes, her back pressing into the cold plaster. "Austin, he's my husband. We were in public. What did you expect me to do, ignore him?" She tried to push past him, but he didn't move an inch, his frame blocking her path like a living barricade. "I expect you to remember who you are when the cameras aren't rolling," he countered, the words tasting like copper and salt. The loyalty he had once felt for Dizzy had completely rotted away, replaced by a toxic entitlement. He didn't care about the years of brotherhood, or the fact that he was the intruder. He only cared about the way Portia's smile had looked when it was directed at someone else. He was no longer content with being the secret. He wanted to be the only reality she knew. "You're being irrational," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's my husband, Austin. You knew that when this started." "Maybe I'm tired of knowing it," he snapped, his grip tightening on her waist. The lines weren't just blurred anymore, they were gone. Austin wasn't just losing his grip on the secret, he was losing his grip on himself. He looked at her, his vision clouded by a dark, jealous fog, realizing that his lack of foresight had led him into a trap of his own making. He had set out to steal a prize, but now the prize was stealing his mind, leaving him angry, possessive, and dangerously close to burning the whole house down just to see the sparks. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Austin's penthouse, glinting off the polished surfaces of platinum records and half-empty bottles of expensive tequila. He was leaning over his kitchen island, scrolling through a sequence of new tracks, when his phone vibrated with a notification from an unknown number. He tapped it carelessly, expecting a demo from an aspiring artist or a late-night text from a club promoter. Instead, the screen bloomed with a high-resolution image that made the air in his lungs turn to lead for exactly 1 second. It was a shot taken from the shadows of the rooftop bar they had visited 3 nights ago. The lighting was moody, but the subjects were unmistakable. Austin leaning in with a proprietary hand on Portia's waist, and Portia looking at him with a raw, unguarded heat that no friend should ever inspire. There was no text, no ransom demand, just the silent, digital evidence of his betrayal. A normal man would have felt the walls closing in. A loyal friend would have been sickened by the sight of his hand on his brother's wife. But Austin was neither of those things. He stared at the screen, and slowly the cold shock was replaced by a familiar, toxic arrogance. He let out a short, dry laugh, tossing the phone onto the marble counter as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. "Is that all?" he muttered to the empty room. In his world, money and influence acted as a universal solvent, capable of dissolving any scandal or silencing any witness. He convinced himself that the photo was likely the work of a low-level paparazzo looking for a payday or a disgruntled studio hand trying to shake him down. He was Austin, the kingmaker of the city's music scene. He was the man who turned whispers into anthems. He didn't hide from threats, he crushed them. He didn't call Portia to warn her. He didn't reach out to his security team to trace the number. Instead, he deleted the message with a flick of his thumb, as if erasing the pixels could erase the reality of his recklessness. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a twisted sense of invincibility that only deepened his resolve to keep going. If someone was watching, let them watch. To Austin, the risk wasn't a warning, it was a spotlight. He stood up, adjusted his designer watch, and headed for the door, already planning his next meeting with Portia. He was operating on a level where consequences were for lesser men, never realizing that the first warning isn't meant to stop the fall. It's simply the sound of the ground getting closer. The air in the recording booth was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt coffee, a sanctuary that was starting to feel more like an interrogation room. Dizzy sat hunched over the soundboard, his eyes fixed on a frozen waveform. But he wasn't listening to the music. He was listening to the silence of his own home. Austin stood behind him, leaning against the doorframe with a casualness that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He could see the tension in the set of Dizzy's shoulders, a rigidness that no amount of studio success could smooth over. "Austin, man, something's off," Dizzy muttered, his voice sounding hollow in the acoustically perfect room. He didn't look up. "Portia, she's different. She's jumpy. And I keep seeing your car in the neighborhood on days I'm supposed to be at the label. Are we good, bro?" Austin didn't flinch. He didn't let the adrenaline spike show in his eyes. Instead, he let out a short, scoffing laugh, the kind of sound a mentor makes when a student says something particularly foolish. He walked over and clapped a hand on Dizzy's shoulder, feeling the muscle twitch under his palm. "You're spiraling, Diz," Austin said, his voice dripping with a calm, condescending concern. "The pressure of this rollout is getting to you. You're working 20-hour shifts, you're barely sleeping, and now you're seeing shadows where there's only sunlight. My car, I've been meeting with that new songwriter 3 blocks over from your place. I told you that last week. Maybe if you weren't so buried in the mix, you'd remember. Dizzy finally turned, his eyes bloodshot and weary. I don't know, man. It just feels like I'm losing her. Like there's a wall between us. That wall is your own paranoia, Dizzy, Austin countered, stepping closer, his shadow falling over the soundboard. You're neglecting her with these sessions, and instead of taking responsibility, you're looking for someone to blame. You're questioning me, the guy who's been holding down your business while you chase this platinum dream. That's low, even for a guy as stressed as you are. He watched the doubt flicker in Dizzy's eyes, followed by a wave of soul-crushing guilt. Austin twisted the knife with practiced precision, making his best friend feel like the villain for even daring to notice the truth. He painted a picture of a loyal friend and a struggling husband, effectively burying the reality of the affair under a mountain of psychological static. By the time Austin left the booth, Dizzy was apologizing for his unfounded suspicions, and the web of lies had grown strong enough to trap them all. Austin walked toward the exit, his face a mask of concern, while internally he marveled at how easy it was to blind a man who was already afraid of the dark. The walls of the penthouse seemed to be inching closer with every passing hour, a gilded cage that was starting to feel like a tomb. Portia sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the news, terrified that every headline about a music industry scandal was a veiled reference to her own life. The thrill that had once fueled her pulse had been replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She looked up at Austin, who was pacing the length of the room with the restless energy of a caged tiger, and for the first time, she didn't see a lover. She saw a jailer. I can't do this anymore, Austin, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a guilt that had become physical. Every time Dizzy looks at me with those tired, trusting eyes, I feel like I'm suffocating. We have to tell him. If we tell him now, maybe. Maybe what? Austin snapped, spinning around to face her. The mask of the charismatic producer was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intensity. He crossed the room in 3 strides, looming over her until she was forced to look up into eyes that had turned into chips of ice. You think he's going to forgive you? You think he's going to shake my hand and thank us for the honesty? Wake up, Portia. If this comes out, he loses his mind. You lose your life of luxury, and I lose everything I've built. But the photos, Austin, someone is watching us, she pleaded, reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched away from her touch, his possessiveness curdling into a dark, suffocating control. Nobody is watching us because I say so, and you aren't confessing anything. He grabbed her phone from the coffee table, his thumb dancing over the screen as he changed her security settings. From now on, you don't go anywhere without me. You don't take calls that I haven't cleared. You're becoming a liability, and I don't tolerate liabilities. You're hurting me, she gasped as his grip tightened on her wrist. I'm saving us, he hissed, his face inches from hers. Dizzy is already suspicious. One wrong word, one guilty look, and the whole house of cards comes down. You wanted to be the center of someone's world, didn't you? Well, congratulations. You're the center of mine, and I don't let go of what's mine. He was no longer protecting a secret. He was protecting a prize, and his lack of foresight was being replaced by a desperate, iron-fisted tyranny. As he stared her down, forcing her into a terrified silence, Austin realized he was no longer running toward a goal. He was running away from a ghost, and he was willing to break Portia's spirit just to keep the haunting at bay. The spiral was accelerating, and Austin was pulling them both down into the dark, convinced that as long as he held the reins, they would never hit the bottom. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the celebratory hum of the city's elite, all gathered to toast the man who seemingly had it all. Austin moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a king, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a proprietary grip on the small of Portia's back with the other. He felt invincible. Even the shadowy threats of the past weeks felt small in the face of such opulence. Beside him, Portia was a vision in shimmering gold, though her smile was a brittle mask held together by sheer terror. Dizzy stood on the stage, tapping the microphone to capture the room's attention, his face glowing with a genuine, brotherly pride that should have made Austin's blood run cold. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," Dizzy began, his voice echoing with warmth. "We're here to celebrate a man who has been my right hand, my brother, and the heartbeat of this label. Austin, man, this one's for you." As the crowd cheered, Dizzy turned toward the massive LED screen behind him, intended to play a tribute montage of Austin's career highlights. Austin offered a humble nod, his arrogance peaking at the exact moment the lights dimmed. But the music that flared over the speakers wasn't one of his chart-topping hits. It was a distorted, raw recording of a hushed conversation, his own voice, unmistakable and predatory, whispering promises to Portia in the shadows of the studio. The ballroom plunged into a suffocating silence as the screen flickered to life. Instead of accolades, it displayed a searing slideshow of The Secret. There was the photo from the rooftop bar, followed by a dozen more. Austin and Portia in a heated embrace in the studio hallway, Austin's car parked outside the penthouse at dawn, and a final, devastating shot of them in a hotel lobby, their hands intertwined in a way that left no room for denial. The hum of the air conditioning became the only sound in the room as the images looped, larger than life and impossible to retract. Austin felt the world tilt, the champagne glass slipping from his nerveless fingers and shattering on the marble floor, a sharp, crystalline punctuation to his downfall. He looked up at the stage and saw the light die in Dizzy's eyes, replaced by a hollow, shattered vacuum of betrayal. The best friend mask hadn't just slipped, it had been incinerated in front of everyone who mattered. Portia let out a broken sob and fled toward the exit, but Austin remained rooted to the spot, the target of 100 judging eyes. The blackmailer hadn't wanted money. They had wanted a front row seat to the total annihilation of Austin's soul. In the cold, bright light of the ballroom, Austin realized that his lack of second thoughts had finally led him to the only end he truly deserved, a public execution of his character, with his best friend as the primary witness. The silence that followed the gala was far more deafening than the scandal itself. Dizzy didn't scream, didn't throw a punch, and didn't seek a public apology. He simply vanished from their world with a surgical precision that left Austin reeling. Within 48 hours, Austin's access to the studio was revoked. His producer credits were being scrubbed from upcoming releases, and his legal team informed him that Dizzy had initiated a total severance of their business and personal ties. The brother who had been his anchor was gone, leaving behind a void that no amount of industry clout could fill. Austin had spent his life thinking he was the one in control, but in the wake of the exposure, he realized he was merely a ghost in a kingdom he had helped burn to the ground. He and Portia retreated to a secluded rental on the coast, a place meant for a romantic escape that now felt like a high-security prison. The magnetic beauty that had once fueled Austin's obsession was still there, but it was marred by a permanent mask of grief. They sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the sound of the crashing waves outside mocking the stillness between them. There were no more secrets to keep, no more risks to take, and no more Dizzy to blame for their unhappiness. They had finally won each other, but the prize tasted like ash. "He sent the final papers today," Portia said, her voice a hollow shell of its former vibrance. She didn't look at Austin. She looked through him, her eyes fixed on a future that held nothing but the weight of their choices. "He's moving the label to London. He's not coming back, Austin." Austin reached out to touch her hand, but he stopped mid-air, his fingers trembling. The possessiveness that had driven him was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical realization. He had destroyed his best friend to get this woman, and she had betrayed her husband to get him. But without the friction of The Secret, there was nothing left to hold them together. They weren't a power couple. They were two survivors of a self-inflicted wreck, clinging to each other because no one else would have them. Every touch was now a reminder of the man they had lost. Every kiss was tainted by the memory of the bro code Austin had laughed at and the vows Portia had discarded. They were lost in each other, just as Austin had planned, but it wasn't a dream. It was a life sentence. As the sun set over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor, Austin finally looked at the woman he had ruined a life for. He saw the regret in her eyes and felt the rot in his own heart, realizing that their victory was the most absolute defeat he would ever know. They had the world to themselves and it was empty. Thank you for watching to this story. Subscribe and follow for more interesting stories.